This wild lynx trusted a man, but what it discovered left him in tears. The wind howled through the endless stretch of snow-covered pines, rattling the window panes of the isolated cabin. Daniel sat in the dim glow of a flickering lantern, staring at the untouched pages of his leather-bound journal. He hadn't written in months. Words felt meaningless now. It had been 2 years since his wife, Miriam, had passed. The cancer had come swiftly, mercilessly, leaving him unmoored. Before, he had spent decades studying wildlife, traveling across the northern wilderness, documenting the delicate balance of predator and prey. Now, he had become a ghost of himself, retreating to the Yukon's vast, frozen expanse where he could disappear without a trace. Life had shrunk to a simple routine, chopping firewood, fishing when the river thawed, and watching the snow fall through the cabin window. He spoke to no one. The nearest town was miles away, and he preferred it that way. People meant questions, pitying glances, unwanted reminders of the world he had left behind. Outside, the temperature had dropped well below freezing. Daniel tossed another log into the wood stove and stood, stretching the stiffness from his legs. That's when he heard it, something faint against the howl of the wind. A sound that didn't belong. A low, deliberate scratching at the door. Daniel frowned. The cold was brutal this time of year. No animal should be wandering so close to a human dwelling. He reached for the rifle propped against the wall, his heart pounding as he moved toward the door. Slowly, he unlatched it and pulled it open. And there, standing against the swirling snow, was a lynx. Its golden eyes locked onto his, unafraid. Daniel stood frozen in the doorway, breath curling in the icy air. The lynx stared back, its tufted ears flicking as if weighing his presence. Its coat, thick and silver gray, blended almost seamlessly with the snowdrifts behind it. Most wild lynxes bolted at the first sign of a human. But this one didn't run. Instead, it took a slow step forward and lowered its head. Something dropped from its mouth, landing with a soft plop onto the porch. Then, just as silently as it had appeared, the lynx turned and padded back into the darkness. Daniel hesitated before kneeling. His fingers brushed the object, a scrap of cloth, faded and frayed at the edges. He turned it over in his hand, the material stiff from the cold. It looked old, weathered by time and exposure. He scanned the tree-line, but the lynx had vanished. The next night, Daniel heard the same scratching at the door. He opened it without hesitation. There it was again, those piercing golden eyes watching him from the shadows. And this time, it left something else. A broken leather collar, the metal buckle rusted. Daniel's chest tightened. A collar? Lynxes weren't domesticated. No one kept them as pets. So why was this one carrying human artifacts? Each night, the lynx returned. And each night, it brought more strange offerings. Scraps of old rope. A weathered button. And then, a child's mitten, its fabric stiff and stiffened with age. A shiver that had nothing to do with the cold ran down Daniel's spine. What was this lynx trying to tell him? By the fourth night, his curiosity had become an obsession. After the lynx dropped yet another item, a tarnished belt buckle, Daniel made up his mind. He had to follow it. He packed a thermos of coffee, strapped on his snowshoes, and waited. When the lynx arrived, he didn't take his eyes off it. The moment it turned to leave, he stepped off the porch and followed. At first, the animal seemed indifferent to his presence, gliding effortlessly through the snow. But as Daniel pressed on, the lynx would pause just long enough to ensure he was still behind. It wanted him to follow. The realization sent his pulse racing. For miles, they trekked deeper into the wilderness, past frozen streams and skeletal trees. The wind carried a whisper of something familiar, a scent buried deep in Daniel's memory. Then, the lynx stopped. Its head lowered, eyes fixed on a small rise in the snowdrift ahead. Daniel's breath caught as he realized what he was looking at. Half buried in the frost, the remnants of an old, abandoned cabin. And something inside was waiting to be found. The lynx didn't come that night. Daniel paced by the window, his gut twisting with unease. Every night since their strange ritual began, the lynx had appeared. But now, nothing. Something was wrong. The next morning, as dawn barely touched the frozen landscape, Daniel strapped on his snowshoes and followed the lynx's tracks. The cold was brutal, sinking its teeth into his exposed skin. Snow clung to the branches like ghostly fingers, muffling every sound except his own breath. The tracks wove deeper into the wilderness than Daniel had ever dared to go. The lynx had led him far the night before, but now, pushing even farther, he spotted it just ahead. The lynx stood motionless atop a rise, staring at something below. When Daniel reached its side, his breath caught in his throat. Half buried in ice and time, the remains of an abandoned cabin slumped against the weight of winter. Its roof had caved in, the wood blackened with age. Wind howled through its skeletal frame. Daniel's pulse pounded as he stepped closer. He could almost feel the past pressing against him. Inside, frost-coated furniture lay in ruin, a shattered lantern frozen to the floor. And in the corner, his stomach twisted, a bundle of frozen remains, wrapped in tattered blankets, long forgotten by the world. He swallowed hard. Who had died here? Then, something caught his eye. A leather-bound diary, brittle with age, sat atop a collapsed table. He picked it up, fingers numb as he flipped through its pages. The entries were faint but clear enough to piece together the story. A man, perhaps a hunter or trapper, had taken shelter here during a brutal winter. Injured. Starving. Alone. His last words were scrawled in shaking handwriting. Snow won't stop. Too weak. If found, tell my family. I tried. Daniel exhaled sharply, the weight of it settling in his chest. The lynx had been guiding him here. The objects weren't random, they were fragments of this man's life. Pieces of a forgotten story, left untold in the snow. Daniel turned to the lynx, his throat tight. The creature sat watching him, golden eyes deep with something more than instinct. It had remembered. And it had led him here for a reason. Daniel stood in the wreckage, the diary trembling in his hands. The weight of the discovery pressed down on him like the heavy Yukon snow. The lynx had led him here, not just by chance, but with purpose. A deep sorrow welled up in his chest. This man, whoever he had been, had died alone, lost to time and winter. If not for the lynx, his story would have remained buried forever. Daniel knew what he had to do. With quiet reverence, he gathered what remained of the traveler, wrapping the bones in his own heavy coat. The journey back to his cabin was slow, each step burdened with the weight of history. When he finally reached his land, he found a peaceful spot near the trees and dug a grave, despite the frozen earth fighting him at every turn. He marked it with a simple wooden cross, carving the words, "A soul remembered." That night, as Daniel sat by his fire, exhausted but at peace, the lynx returned. It didn't scratch at the door or linger in its usual spot. Instead, it placed a final object on the porch, a small wooden carving, worn by time but still recognizable. Daniel picked it up, turning it in his hands. A tiny figure of a lynx, hand-carved, perhaps by the lost traveler himself. A message. A farewell. A mission, now complete. When he looked up, the lynx was gone, slipping silently into the trees. In the days that followed, Daniel found himself changed in ways he hadn't expected. For years, he had let grief isolate him, but the lynx had pulled him back into the world, not with words, but with unwavering persistence. Determined to honor the story that had unfolded in the depths of the Yukon, Daniel began writing. His article, part memoir, part tribute, detailed the lynx's strange intelligence, its quiet determination, and the mystery it had unraveled. He shared it with a small wildlife journal, expecting little. Instead, the story spread, touching hearts across the country. Letters arrived from strangers moved by the lynx's actions. Some wrote about lost loved ones, others about the inexplicable bonds between humans and animals. Daniel no longer felt alone. One crisp morning, as he sipped coffee on his porch, a familiar shape emerged from the tree line. The lynx stood at a distance, watching him. Daniel smiled, feeling no need to call out or move closer. They had already said everything that needed to be said. With a final, lingering glance, the lynx turned and disappeared into the wilderness. Daniel watched until it was gone, then exhaled a breath he didn't know he was holding. For the first time in years, he felt something close to peace.